Okay, hi everyone. Can you hear me? These mics are, it's a little hard to tell, but it's okay? Okay. So hello and welcome. My name's Alexis Lowry. I'm curator here at Dia Art Foundation. And I had the pleasure of working with James Meyer and Mel Bochner on the installation that we are within and surrounded by. But before I introduce them both, I just want to say a couple of quick thank yous to everybody at Dia who helped make today's event possible and also this installation. So we have Heidi Giannotti here, who is our Director of Exhibitions, without whom this would not have been possible. And then Maria Celli and our entire visitor services team, who've been amazing. And Dan Wolf, who makes all the AV things that happen at Dia happen. So thank you, everyone. And I won't give long introductions, just so that we can get to the heart of the thing, and also because I'm speaking to two giants in their field who don't really need them. But I want to say a few words. So firstly, James Meyer wrote the book on minimalism, literally. It is called Minimalism. And it's really the Bible for those of us who are interested in the period. He's currently curator of modern art at the National Gallery and academic advisor to Dia, but he was also, for an important period of time, our deputy director and chief curator. It's during that period that he introduced this project and also the project that we did with Barry LeVay to our program. So we're very glad to have him. He's the recipient of too many grants and honors to list, and the author of many publications, including the aforementioned Minimalism, Art and Politics in the 60s, a book about the Dwan Gallery, which is also very, I think, important if you're interested in this period. And his most recent book, The Art of the Return, the 60s and Contemporary Culture, was published last year, and it considers kind of the lasting influence and present relevance of the 1960s, a revolutionary period in both art and politics. And it's part art history, part criticism, part memoir, part fiction. It really meanders through various genres, which, in my opinion, is what makes it unique and fascinating as a contribution to the study of this period. And considering the decade and its recurrence in contemporary art. And so surrounded here by a work first conceived in the late 60s, that seems particularly appropriate. I've had the pleasure of working with James in various capacities for about 5 years now, but I have known Mel Bochner for almost 20. I first met him as an intern at Two Palms Press during my first job in the arts, where Mel was making prints, and Two Palms is where he continues to make much of his monotypes, much of his work in general, with the support of that team. So it's been really thrilling to watch him once again, in a slightly different capacity, create work close up. So that's been, thank you for letting me. Tag along. Mel was born in Pittsburgh. He received his BFA from the School of Art at the Carnegie Mellon, and went on to study philosophy at Northwestern before moving to New York in 1964. Since the 60s, his practice has interrogated the relationship between image, language, and various other forms of systematic thinking through a wide variety of media, including installation, photography, painting. I don't want to say sculpture because I know, but sculpture. He's a leading figure in what we might call the emergence of conceptual art, though, again, a contested term for Mel, perhaps, and was a prolific critic in the period who really helped theorize the emergence of a wide variety of practices associated with conceptual art, post-minimalism, and minimalism. And like James, whose accomplishments are too numerous to list, but they include important solo shows at the Carnegie Mellon, Yale University Art Gallery, the Jewish Museum, and of course, Dia Art Foundation. So before we dive in really quickly, I just want to say, after the talk, we have signed copies of an incredible book that Mel produced with us on this series, the Measurement series. And we have signed copies, just a few left, of James's book, The Art of the Return. So join us afterwards. And then I just want to dive into our questions. So we're surrounded by a work called Measurement Room, No Vantage Point. Mel was invited by James and the team at DIA to make the work on the occasion of the 50th anniversary of the first measurement room he created at Heiner Friedrich's gallery in Munich in 1969, Heiner being one of DIA's co-founders. And the installation combines aspects of that installation, that first measurement room, with another proposed project called No Vantage Point that was never realized. So it's, in that sense, both a hybrid and a new work, and historical and contemporary, which resonates with something Mel recently said in the New York Times. So I'm going to quote you here, sorry. "The things I did in the 60s, they didn't even get reviewed, and suddenly it's a historical work. What I realized was, at least in my own terms, history is what happens behind your back when you're not looking. You set in motion a chain of events, and you try to follow them to their conclusion wherever they take you. Sometimes it's something really interesting, sometimes it's nothing, and you don't know till you take the trip." So seems like a good prompt for considering. You did say that, yeah. So I wanted to know if you could take us back to the origin point of this trip and talk to us a little bit about how you came about making measurement pieces at all.
Can you hear me without the mic? Now can you hear me? Is that better? Yeah, okay. In 1968, there was a group called Experiments in Art and Technology that was run by Robert Rauschenberg and Billy Kluver that were trying to advance ideas of technology and art together. And they did projects that they actually sponsored, and then other people commissioned them to do projects, one of which was the Singer Laboratories out in New Jersey, who I think were in competition with, what was Kluver's? Not AT&T, I can't. Bell Labs, that's right. When they had an artist as a, I don't know what you call it. So there was a little competition, and different people submitted ideas, and make a long story short, I was chosen. And so I would go out there 2 days a week to Denville, New Jersey. And it basically, the ideas I had for projects, they couldn't do. I had one idea for a computer project, but in those days, the computers were almost the size of this room. And you had to have a special language to program them. And the programmer said, "You can do this faster by hand. It'll take me a year just to write the program." So that was it for computers in 1968. So basically, it just became myself and this group of engineers, scientists, physicists who were, on the payroll, sitting around and talking, brainstorming. And what it came down to was trying to find something to talk about and trying to find a language to talk about it in. And what I began to realize was the only thing that people in the sciences, as it were, would accept as being verifiable was measurements. Everything had to have measurements. And the measurements had to be tested. And if they came out different measurements, then your theory was wrong. So they had this belief in the truth of measurement. I was very skeptical of this. And so one day, I came in early, and just in different places around the lab with some letters set and some tape, I marked different measurements, basically of nothing. So they were signs, or they were signifiers, or they were signifiers without signs, or they were signs without signifiers, but what the hell were they? But I didn't say anything. And then they came to work, and they were walking, what's this? Like 10 inches between a can of Windex and the corner of the door. This started a really, for the first time, interesting conversation. Because they could not wrap their heads around this. And I had the laboratory had a photographer on staff, and I had him photograph all these little installations. And then print them. And when he printed them, it was very mysterious because depending on where he was standing and what the focal length of the camera was and all of that, 12 inches in this photograph was this big, and 12 inches in this photograph was this big. So there was no indexical relationship. And I thought, that's really interesting. That's really interesting. Because I've been doing a lot of work with photography at this point. So the next thing I thought of was having myself photographed against the wall. I drew 12-inch measurement, and I stood sideways. They took my photograph, and then I put up my hand. They took the photograph of my hand. And I told the printer, print this so that in the photograph, the 12-inch measurement is exactly 12 inches. So now there was a complete indexical relationship to reality. In other words, it was like Alice through the looking glass. And then I thought, what the hell do I need to photograph for? So I went home and started making these little measurements around my studio, and one thing led to another, and now you see this. Is that enough?
Sure.
Well, but there's a little more about one thing leading to another. So there's also the role of the paper and the 48-inch standard piece where you put up a sheet of wrapping paper in its standard size that it came in. Was it 3 by 4 feet?
Yeah, 36 by 40.
And you measured it. Wasn't that kind of a stage that then leads to the whole room at Heiner Friedrich?
Yeah, there were interim things, and if you're in a book buying mood, there's a book that just came out at the bookstore. What happened was I was thinking, well, maybe I could do some drawings of this or put them on paper, and I put up 2 pieces of paper on the wall, and I just couldn't think of anything to do, but I suddenly noticed the space between the 2 sheets of paper. And I thought the space between the 2 sheets of paper was more interesting than the paper or anything I could put on it at that point. So I measured that space, left that up for a while, didn't know where it was going. And then one day I just took down the sheets of paper, and there was this measurement on the wall. Then I thought, well, just a measurement on the wall with no references, going back to what I did at Singer Labs. And so I started thinking about just what was in my studio. Just common art supply, things like wrapping paper, tape, and stuff like that. And I started with some sheets of wrapping paper that were 36 by 48, and I stapled them to the wall, and I made the measurements, and I began to think that I wasn't interested in brown paper per se, although it's a beautiful thing. But I like the idea of common materials and things that are just around, or in the words of your essay, the world as I found it, like trying not to add something to the world, but use what the world has given you back. So there was that whole series of measurement pieces, and as the pieces of paper on the wall opened up more and more, the space of the wall really started to enter. And the space of the wall was more interesting than the space of the paper. And pretty soon I was able to drop the paper, or I finished with the paper. And I began thinking of where could I take this? Now, all these stories have to be embedded in a certain period of time, because nobody works in a vacuum, and I believe that all art has a discursive side. In other words, you're in a conversation with something or somebody. Mm-hmm. And at that time, the dominant discourse, as they say in quotation marks, was minimalism. And I guess you could say the real theoretician or philosopher, as it were, of minimalism was Judd. Thinking about Judd's boxes, it came to my mind that what is that box? It's the room collapsed in on itself, right? In that way, not much different than Clement Greenberg's, idea of the four sides of the canvas mimicking the wall. So then the question becomes, well, what's the largest object you can put in a space? The space itself. So the space, the object, the architecture becomes the ground for making what you could call an intervention, because what this is an intervention into the space. So that's kind of a capsule version.
That kind of the reference back to Judd and certain kind of object-based minimalism, and thinking about the serial work, the work that you did in series versus the serial work, I think is a good segue into a question that, James, I know you had, and I noted diligently. Could you talk a little bit about maybe the distinction between what you describe as the serial attitudes versus working in series?
Yes, in fact, I wanted to put you on the spot.
Yeah.
Because you often do.
Yes, but this is a good point to put you on the spot, because in your wonderful essay from 1967, The Serial Attitude, you make this distinction between the serial way of working, which you were advocating basically, a kind of non-subjective, you come up with a system and it generates, if you will, almost by itself the piece, which, looking at Judd's progressions, Carl Andre's bricks, 137, prime number, just these sort of number system generating
And
Solowit and your own work, all your drawings from 66 to up to this point. You're attempting to, we could say, purge subjectivity, decision-making from work and allowing a sort of system to generate it. Of course, a great interest in process is always central to your work and to these works. But then you say working in series. Working in series is more subjective, and you associate it with Morandi, I think, and maybe with Monet, is that in the essay?
Yeah.
And it seemed at that point, 67, that you thought that was a little too subjective. It's not true serialism. And I'm wondering if with the measurement works, you're starting to work in series. Because of course you've never been bound to anything. You come up with a position and then you do something else. You keep going. And I wondered whether the measurements, in a sense, are, in a way, moving away from the serial attitude. Or if they extend it.
No. I think it's a really good question. I mean, the serial attitude was trying to take a lot of work that was happening at that moment, the artists that you've mentioned and other people as well, and finding a kind of commonality. And the commonality, besides the interest in, let's say, purging subjectivity, which is of course ridiculous because you can't purge subjectivity, but at least minimizing it, reducing it down so that art's just not an expression of ego or, sentiment. All these people were doing something that looked very different. I mean, a Flavin Light versus an Andre Brick, for example. So what I was proposing was there's an attitude that unites all these works. And there was a way of seeing the world, a way of being in the world and trying to make art, as opposed to a stylistic commonality. So, I have nothing against Monet or Morandi, but my point was that, Morandi has 3 bottles in this painting, 4 bottles in that painting, 6 bottles in this painting. Monet has 4 haystacks, 2 haystacks. I mean, in other words, there's a thematic running through that work. There is no logic running through that work that you can perceive or take away from it. And my point was the serial attitude was whatever these people were doing, the people I was interested in, there was a relationship between works and within the work that had a certain kind of logic to it. And to me, that was something new. That was something that I did not see a precedent for in art history. Now, a lot of people didn't agree with me, but then I don't think they really understood the concept. And the other thing is, I guess, as you get older, you don't necessarily get, well, I hope you don't necessarily get less rigorous, but you might give yourself a little bit more permission without becoming permissive.
In some ways, this is a serial. Your measurement works are systemic. I mean, there's the pre-given languages of measurement, of mensuration. There's the pre-given wall.
Yes, that's a given.
In many ways, it's consistent with that. But it does unfold as a series. I mean, you take that first piece of paper, the standard, the pre-given sheet, you measure it, and then it leads to a series of possibilities. The book of your measurements is really about a whole series that comes out of a systemic way of working.
Yeah, and I think slowly starts to move away from it. I sort of thought of people like LeWitt and Andre and Judd in musical terms as being followers of Bach. And in the brown paper pieces, this is very presumptuous, but I'll say it, I thought of myself as being Mozart.
And what does that mean?
Well, it means that there's
Apart from your aspiration to genius, transcendent art making, what is the difference?
The difference is that Bach starts out with 4 notes, B, A, C, H, and he plays them upside down, inside out, right side up, and you can always trace the logic of those, notational progressions. Whereas Mozart starts out with a theme, and then he does whatever the hell he wants to do with it. And it goes somewhere, and it's closer to jazz in a way, and then suddenly, when you think that's lost, it comes back. It returns. So that was a different way of thinking of how series, what I used to say to myself, spin out. And, there's a certain kind of artist who has a certain kind of idea, and that's their idea, and they work through it for years on end. Then there's another kind of artist who is, let's say, more impatient and believes that you can never reconcile all the contradictions in your work, or your person for that matter. And that instead of denying those contradictions, you should explore them. Or in the words of that great 20th century philosopher Yogi Berra, when you come to a fork in the road, take it.
Mel, one thing that you said recently to James and I when thinking about this work was that you see it as kind of a limit point of an expression of a kind of minimalism, despite it may be existing in a category outside of minimalism, but that somehow it's sort of visually expressing the limit point. And so I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about how you see that operating, given this discussion we just had about the distinction between seriality and working in series.
Well,
seriality.
Minimalism is essentially an indoor art.
Mm-hmm.
And when you're talking about scale and size and the difference between those, you're always bound by the space that you're in. And so my perception was to use the space as the work. Where a lot of confusion came in was the notion of conceptual art, which is a term I don't like, and which tried to make a point that art needed no physical or visual expression. And that was something that, first of all, I didn't think was possible. And being just enough of a materialist myself, and not an idealist, I couldn't go down that road because, as somebody once said, idealism is a failed revolution. So the notion that you would totally eliminate both the physical and the visual was anathema to me, and I've never seen anybody do it anyway.
And yet, when you were talking with Elaine Varian about the origins of the measurement works, and talking about how one might acquire or live with this work, you kind of describe the work as both, one gets a drawing, and of course, or some kind of evidence of its existence. Sometimes you also physically install the work for them. But the work can exist in multiple places at once, and you describe that in that sense as the work is it's a portable idea rather than a portable object. Which...
Yeah, I don't know if I agree with that anymore.
That's that hindsight thing.
It's the hindsight thing, and it's also too much stress on the work as an idea. I mean, I don't even know what an idea is, to tell you the truth. And
You kind of remind me of Flavin saying to me, I don't know why I used lights.
yeah, but he never gave them up.
Nor have you given up ideas.
Yeah, I don't think of them as ideas. I don't know what, like I said, I don't know what an idea is. And the things that people call ideas are usually descriptions or directions or, you know, I don't know what. But to my satisfaction, nobody's defined an idea. I like more the notion of intuitions or hunches or responses or, you know, that moment when the light bulb goes off on your head. Because talking about ideas, it sounds like it's predictable. You know, oh, and that idea, and then that leads to that idea. But my experience as an artist is that nothing is really predictable. And if I knew what I was going to have at the end of the day at 9 o'clock in the morning, I either wouldn't go in my studio or I'd slit my wrists because I don't want to know. And that doesn't mean that whatever happens is going to be good, because most of the time it's not very good. But that's the fun of it. And if you're not able to, let's say, court unpredictability, then what's the point?
One of the ideas to ask Mel to do this piece is that, as you've heard, the first measurement room was at Heiner Friedrich's gallery in Munich in 1969, a season which you've pointed out also included the first Earth room of De Maria, and also Michael Heiser's Munich Depression. So Heiser, De Maria, these artists we very much associate with Dia and Dia's history, and with Beekman. And so Mel had done the first measurement room in that very small gallery 50 years ago. So it was very important to bring this piece into this space, into Dia's present and Dia's future, and to think about the two spaces. And what's happened to scale, what's happened to display, what's happened to the gallery and the museum since 1969. Because the photos of Heiner Friedrich's gallery in Munich, it makes it look like it was very small. And so this is a great change in scale. So it's not only about your work and your history with Heiner and Dia, but it's also about the history of display. Working in a room like this, was it a very different experience? I mean, what is it for you, Mel, to if you will, remake the piece in a whole different scale, and yet connecting it back to 69, to that scale, and to the, if you will, the origins of Dia?
Well, when I first walked into this space, and it was empty, and James said, "Oh, you can have this space." And I thought, are you out of your fucking mind? What could you possibly do in here to make a difference? And the first thought I had was, nothing. And then I thought, yeah, I guess that's what I'll do. I'll just do nothing. I'll just measure this space. I think what's interesting, if I become self-reflective, which I don't like becoming, is that certain things, and I'm going to call them ideas as shorthand right now, certain ideas have the potential to return. And you don't know that when you first do something. You do something, it's a response to a moment, a situation, an intellectual, a psychological, an emotional place that you are. And then maybe years later you look at it, and as I say about these things, I ask myself, is there any juice left in that lemon? Maybe I'll give it another squeeze. So the notion of display is really interesting, because let's take abstract expressionism. We see abstract expressionist paintings, or any of the paintings here in a space like this. They don't look so big. But if you go back to the little rooms, the apartments that people lived in when the wall was 16 feet and the painting was 15 feet, it's like, oh my God, that's the biggest thing I ever saw in my life. So that's part of the history of display. You know, we've changed our perception of scale. And I think that's what happened here. I mean, the biggest problem for me about this wasn't really thinking of the idea, quote unquote, but how to scale it up. Because in the original, I used like 1/2-inch black tape and the numbers were 2 inches. And if I did that here, it would disappear in, 30 feet. This is the length of a football field.
Yeah, so it's about 300 feet from end to end.
And so I had to, like, in my little studio, experiment with all different sizes so that it would be large enough that you would see it, but not so large that would enter another black hole of display, as it were, and become graphic design. So one's always negotiating that kind of space where you find, and there's no predictability, what the rightness of a decision is, what the rightness of the scale is, what the rightness of the position is. The position in this is easy because it's always at my eye level.
That's 72 inches.
72 inches, yes.
What adjustments did you make to this space? Did you add any baffles, or was everything here?
Basically, everything's here, but there were some walls that didn't have sheetrock. And I have to take my hat off to Heidi, who was great to work with, and she said, anything you want, we'll do. And so it was filled in because that was a brick wall, and that was a brick wall, and the adhesive vinyl wouldn't stick to the brick. The other thing we did was I wanted a vertical. And so there's a column down at that end, but the column was steel, and it had some kind of stuff on it. What was on that thing? It was just concrete over steel. Okay. And the vinyl wouldn't stick. So I thought, okay. I asked Heidi, just build another wall to cover that whole thing. And she said, that's not a good idea. Oh. All right, what if we just build a little wall over the column? That's a better idea. And it sort of came into my mind, Barnett Newman, but it wasn't until those guys put that measurement on there that I thought, oh my God, this really closes the circle of the history of minimalism, doesn't it? And don't I wish that he was still alive to see this? And I'd love to know what he would say.
So I think with that, we should begin to open it up if anybody else has questions as well. There's one in the back. Oh, Dan's got the, we're going to give you a mic because the acoustics are terrible in here.
Is it work? Oh, yes.
Oh, yes.
Sorry. As to the measurement, it's all in feet and inches. If you work in Europe, do you work with centimeters?
So the critic comes in a little later in the afternoon. He looks around. He says, I can't review this show. Why not? He said, you did it in inches and feet. I only know meters. He said, how do I know if it's correct? So out he goes. People in the gallery, oh, that's so awful, he's so stupid. I said, no, he's not. Because he touched on one of the essential points, which is, can you believe this? Now, what I said to him was, I don't know how to measure in meters and centimeters. So I would have to have somebody else do it and then translate it. And then I wouldn't know if it was true, so I couldn't stand behind it. Now, with the passage of years, I've learned how to measure in centimeters. So.
Because it's really nice and exact.
Now I can be exact, yes.
Anyone else? Oh.
Yes, hi there. Not too long ago, can you hear me? We stumbled upon a series of prints that you did in 2007, where you did 1 foot, but you did it in different colors. So could you speak a little bit about that? Because I was thinking about your distinction between the serial attitude and things that Monet was doing with looking at things at different times of the day. So could you speak about why you made that decision?
I think I was at Two Palms when you made those.
What?
I think I was at Two Palms when you made those.
Yes, that's right. I have a great picture of you with paint all over your nose.
War paint, yes.
Well, the thing about prints is you start out with a plate or a matrix. And you might start out with an idea of, well, this would look good this way or this would look good that way. But because the matrix doesn't get destroyed as you're making it, and it's not like making a drawing where you have to, okay, I like this in blue, now make another one in red or something like that. You just clean off the plate and put another color in it. Try it and see what it looks like. So that's also about, to me, not letting your taste or predilections always determine what you're doing. Sometimes you just say, what the hell, let's see what it looks like this. If it looks interesting, good. If it doesn't, throw it away. So I guess some of the ones you saw I liked.
I think we have time for one more.
Thanks so much for such a wonderful conversation and for the wonderful work, Mel. I had a question for you with regard to how people experience the space. I mean, so much of how people walk through DIA involves self-photography, portraiture of other people, right, especially now in our age of Instagram. But also the work itself seems to invite a sort of methodical transversal of space. And given the brackets at the end of each panel, while referencing architectural notation, to me they also seem to mark off certain experiences as you walk through the space. And when I was first here and thinking about the work, I thought about how each time if I'd walk by 16.7 or 16.8, the experience was different, regardless of the difference in measurement and the difference in, or the accordance of measurements. And I just thought, with the brackets especially, and with the columns as sort of breaks between those experiences, if you thought at all about sort of the body and space in relationship to histories of perspectival theory or of representation or different ways in which the body has been accorded to measurements of space, here, of course, realized in real architectural space.
Yeah, I've thought of all those things. You know, when I was taking a first year of philosophy in college, you're studying Plato and Socrates in that period. The enemy is always somebody named Protagoras, right? And Protagoras said, quote unquote, man is the measure of all things, of things that are, that they are, of things that are not, that they are not. And the professor was wont to explain that Pythagoras was full of shit. That Plato was correct, that there's a realm of ideas and everything's generated. I wrote my paper on Protagoras. I thought he was right. So maybe I'm anti-Platonic. But yes, all those things that you said are part of it. What else do we have to measure things by except our own body?
One thing I would add is one way to look at Mel's art, I look at it, is a negotiation of different languages, including obviously written language, mathematical language, different supports, each need to be on a support, but perspective being another language. And before Mel did this kind of work, he did a series of photos, you may know, where he set up sort of perspectives on paper and then crumpled them and kept on sort of reimagining and deflating perspective, making it literal and illusionistic and then destroying it. So it's an interrogation that actually does precede the actual creating of perspectives or exaggerated perspectives in actual rooms, which we're seeing here.
True.
So on that note, I just want to thank you both for being with us here today. Thank you all for joining us. And come back this afternoon when James and Barry LeVay have a chat at 2 p.m. Thanks.